She waded knee-deep into brown water that smelled like rot and diesel, holding a clipboard nobody had asked her to bring, counting fish that nobody else wanted. The truck driver from the hatchery leaned against his tailgate and watched her write numbers down like they mattered, like this was anything other than a favor he was doing himself by not paying a disposal fee. Behind her, 4 ponds sat cracked and half empty on land her grandfather had walked away from 20 years earlier, and in front of her, a hose spat out 2,000 undersized fingerlings that the hatchery had culled for being too small, too pale, or too slow to sell. Nobody in that county thought those fish would survive the week. Nobody thought she would either. The land itself told its own story before she ever touched it. It sat on the edge of a small farming town where the economy had shrunk down to a feed store, a diner, and a co-op that mostly served row crop farmers who had no use for water they couldn't irrigate with. The ponds had been dug decades earlier for a catfish operation that folded when the owner, her grandfather, got sick and the family scattered. What was left were 4 earthen basins choked with algae, silted in on one end, and rimmed with the kind of cattails that meant nobody had touched the banks in years. She had inherited the property, along with a stack of unpaid taxes, and a neighbour who told her, not unkindly, that pond farming was a young man's business, and she was neither young in the way he meant, nor a man. She thanked him and kept walking the bank line, looking for where the water still ran clear. She was 26, working 2 jobs to keep the lights on, when the call came from the hatchery manager, a man named Denny, who ran the regional fingerling operation 2 counties over. His hatchery produced far more fry than it could sell, and every season a percentage came out undersized or slightly deformed, the kind of stock that wholesale buyers wouldn't touch. Normally, those fish went into a dump pond and died off, or got fed to hogs. Denny had heard she had empty ponds and asked, almost as a joke, if she wanted the rejects instead of him paying to haul them off. She said yes before she'd even seen the ponds up close, because free fish was still fish, and fish was still worth more than nothing sitting in stagnant water, doing no one any good. What she didn't know yet, and what she would spend the next 18 months learning the hard way, was that raising fish is not the same as owning water. The first batch of fingerlings went into the largest pond within a week of the delivery, before she had tested oxygen levels, before she had cleared the silt, before she understood that a pond that looks full is not the same as a pond that can support 2,000 mouths. Within 10 days, nearly a third of them were dead, floating along the downwind bank in a scene that made her sick to her stomach and made the neighbour who'd warned her feel, quietly, vindicated. She didn't call Denny to complain. She called the extension office instead and asked them to send someone out who actually knew what they were looking at. The man who showed up was named Otis, a retired aquaculture extension agent who'd spent 30 years walking pond banks across 3 counties and had, by his own account, seen every mistake a first-year farmer could make at least twice. He didn't sugarcoat what he found. The dissolved oxygen was low because the pond was overloaded with organic matter from years of neglect. The stocking density was too high for the pond's condition, and she had fed the fish a commercial ration meant for a different growth stage entirely. But he also saw something in the way she'd kept records, sloppy as they were, every death logged, every water test she could afford scribbled onto the back of a feed receipt. He told her most people who called him out never wrote anything down at all, and that alone told him she might actually make it. Over the following months, Otis became something between a mentor and a conscience, showing up every couple of weeks not because he was paid to, but because, as he put it, a man likes to see whether the seeds he plants take root. He taught her to read a pond the way a farmer reads soil, watching the colour of the water at dawn, checking for the smell of ammonia building up near the inflow, learning that a pond producing 60% survival from fry to harvest across a season was considered excellent even among experienced operators. So her early losses, while brutal, weren't a verdict on her, just a lesson in disguise. He taught her that feed was the single biggest cost in the whole operation, that a £50 bag ran somewhere around $50, and that a pond full of hungry fish could burn through several bags a week once they hit their growth stride, meaning waste was not something she could afford to treat casually. Most importantly, he taught her the discipline of aeration, showing her how to rig a simple paddle wheel system that kept oxygen circulating through the water, even on the still, breathless nights when a pond could crash overnight without anyone noticing until morning. She rebuilt her approach from the ground up. She limed the ponds to correct the pH, cleared out a decade of build-up from the inflow channel, and started keeping the rejected fingerlings in a smaller nursery pond first, letting them stabilize before moving them into the larger grow-out water, exactly the stage system real hatcheries used. Denny kept sending his culls, and instead of dumping every batch into one pond, she started sorting them by size and condition, treating the strongest with more crowding and the weaker ones with more space and gentler feeding. It was slow, unglamorous work, waking before sunrise to check the water, hauling feed sacks in the summer heat, watching a thermometer more closely than she'd ever watched anything in her life, but the numbers started moving in her favor. Survival crept up from that brutal first 30% to something closer to 50, then past 60, matching what Otis had told her the best operators in the region were achieving. Before this story goes any further, if you have made it this far, drop 777 in the comments right now, because what happened next is the part most people watching this would have quit before ever reaching, and I want to know how many of you would have kept going. The turning point came in her second full season, when a batch of catfish that had started as 3-inch rejects nobody wanted reached harvest weight of just over 1.5 pounds, right in the healthy range for market fish. She didn't have a wholesale contract, so she loaded a cooler into her truck and drove to the farmer's market in the next town over, selling fillets straight off the ice to people who had never eaten fish that fresh in their lives. Word moved fast in a small community, the way it always does when something genuinely good shows up when nobody expected it. A local diner owner bought a batch for a Friday fish fry and asked if she could supply him weekly. Then a small grocery co-op in the county seat called, wanting to know if she could scale up. She could not yet, not with 4 aging ponds and 1 part-time hand, but she told them yes anyway, and figured out the rest afterward, the same way she'd figured out everything since the day that truck first backed up to her water. By the 3rd year, she'd renegotiated her arrangement with the hatchery, no longer taking rejects for free, but paying a discounted rate for a steady, reliable supply, because by then she'd proven she could keep the fish alive at a rate hatcheries respected. She dredged a 5th pond, hired 2 more workers from town, including, in a detail that made the whole county talk, the same neighbour who had once told her pond farming was a young man's business, now working her feed schedule 3 mornings a week because the pay was steady and the operation was undeniably real. She began supplying restaurants across 3 counties and eventually crossed state lines, shipping iced fillets to buyers who had heard about the woman who built a business out of fish nobody else would take. Her annual revenue crossed 6 figures before her 4th season closed, a number that would have sounded like fiction to the woman standing in that first stagnant pond with a clipboard and a stranger's rejected fish. What changed in that town wasn't just her bank account. People who once treated her land as a punchline started asking her for advice on their own ponds, on soil, on what it actually took to build something out of almost nothing. Otis still stops by some weekends, less as a teacher now, and more as an old friend checking on work he's proud to have had a hand in. The hatchery still sends her fish, though they aren't rejects anymore. They're simply her stock, ordered on purpose, raised on purpose, sold on purpose. If you have ever looked at something everyone else had given up on and felt that quiet, stubborn urge to try anyway, tell us about it in the comments below. And if this story pulled you in, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.